She dropped the keys and whispered, "Pick them up slowly." That moment changed everything. The day she moved in, the first thing I noticed wasn't the boxes stacked neatly in her doorway or the faint hum of a moving truck retreating down the street. It was the way she carried herself. Confident, graceful, with an almost effortless air that made the humdrum quiet of my apartment complex feel suddenly smaller. I had seen her before in passing, a fleeting silhouette through the shared hallway or a shadow behind the blinds, but I'd never paid attention, not really. Until that afternoon. I was checking my mail when the sound of keys clinking against the hardwood floor made me look up. She was crouched just outside my apartment door, a soft laugh catching in her throat as she reached for a fallen key. "Pick it up slowly," she said, her voice low but clear, carrying a teasing warmth that somehow made my chest tighten. I froze for a moment, the ordinary action of bending down feeling suddenly charged with unspoken meaning. My fingers brushed hers as I reached for the keys, and a strange, quiet shock ran through me. The world outside, the neighbors, the mundane sounds of apartments, seemed to fade, leaving just that small bubble of shared space. Her eyes held mine for a fraction longer than necessary, glimmering with a mix of mischief and something softer, something almost vulnerable. I noticed the faint scent of her perfume, delicate and floral, mingling with the warmth of the afternoon sun that slanted across the hallway. It was the kind of detail that would normally pass unnoticed, but not now. Every subtle shift, how her hair fell over her shoulder, how her fingers lingered near mine, the way she straightened her posture and tilted her head slightly, felt deliberate, intimate in a way that made my thoughts stumble. I handed her the keys, and her fingers brushed mine again, slower this time, just enough to make me aware of the warmth of her skin. "Thank you," she said softly, her smile quiet but somehow brimming with invitation. She stood a little closer than I expected, close enough that I could feel the faint warmth radiating from her, enough that I was acutely aware of my own heartbeat. I tried to keep my expression neutral, but I suspect she noticed the flicker of surprise, and something else, something unspoken, in my gaze. Even after she walked away, leaving a faint echo of laughter and the soft clink of keys in the hallway, I felt a subtle pull in the space where she had stood. The ordinary world felt just a little off-kilter, as if the air itself had shifted. Every subsequent glance down the hall, every sound of her footsteps, made me wonder what might happen the next time our paths crossed. The encounter was brief, almost accidental, yet it left a weighty impression, an unspoken promise that something delicate, intriguing, and undeniably magnetic was beginning between us. By the time I closed my mailbox, the sunlight had dimmed, but the warmth of that fleeting touch lingered. And for the first time in a long while, I felt genuinely curious, not just about the woman next door, but about the slow unraveling of whatever this strange, quiet tension between us might become. After that first encounter, I started noticing her everywhere. Or maybe I just hadn't been paying attention before. The mailroom became a place of small collisions, reaching for the same package at the same time, her hand brushing mine ever so slightly, the warmth lingering like a quiet reminder of that afternoon. There was something almost intoxicating about the way she moved, the subtle confidence in her stride that made the air between us feel charged. Every accidental touch made my chest tighten in a way that was both thrilling and terrifying. One evening, I saw her in the hallway again, balancing grocery bags in each hand. She glanced up, and our eyes met. Something passed in that instant that felt far weightier than a simple greeting. "Need a hand?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. She tilted her head slightly, a small, appreciative smile tugging at her lips. When I helped her with the heavier bag, my fingers grazed hers again, longer this time, and a shiver ran up my spine. It was electric, but quiet, almost shy, as though both of us were silently negotiating the boundaries of familiarity. Over the next few days, our encounters became small, meaningful rituals. Sometimes it was as mundane as a hallway nod or a shared elevator ride, yet every interaction felt charged with an unspoken possibility. I started noticing details I hadn't before. The way her hair caught the light when she leaned over a counter, the faint laughter that seemed to linger after she spoke, the way she would tuck a loose strand behind her ear with a graceful flick of her hand. I couldn't stop myself from watching the subtle movements, the way she carried herself, the quiet authority in her gestures. The physical closeness was always brief, but the tension lingered. A hand resting on the mailroom counter, brushing against mine. Our shoulders barely touching as we maneuvered past each other in the hallway. Every touch was innocent enough on the surface, yet it left an indelible imprint, a warmth that seemed to pulse in my veins long after she had gone. I caught myself replaying those moments, noticing the way her gaze had lingered a second too long, the slight upward curl of her lips when she smiled at nothing in particular. One rainy afternoon, we shared the elevator. She pressed a button for the ground floor, and we stood in the quiet hum of machinery, just a few feet apart. I noticed the faint scent of her perfume mixed with the clean, metallic smell of the elevator. Her hand brushed lightly against the strap of her bag, and for a brief moment, our fingers touched. I felt a small jolt of awareness, my pulse quickening, and I realized that something about these fleeting touches made ordinary spaces feel charged with possibility. Even in the smallest gestures, her hand brushing against my arm while reaching for a package, her laughter as she steadied herself when stepping off a curb, there was a rhythm, a push and pull, a dance that neither of us named but both felt. It was the thrill of closeness without crossing a line, the intimacy of presence and attention, the slow simmer of connection that left me thinking about her long after she had walked away. By the end of that week, the ordinary walls of my life had subtly shifted. The woman next door had become a quiet gravity, pulling my attention, my curiosity, and something I hadn't named yet, a desire to linger just a little longer in her orbit. And the more our paths crossed, the more I realized that these small moments of accidental intimacy were only the beginning. It started with something as simple as a conversation in passing, yet it carried a weight neither of us expected. One evening, I found her in the shared courtyard, watering a small cluster of potted plants she'd arranged with obvious care. The sunlight was low, golden and soft, spilling across the balcony railings and catching in her hair, making it glint like copper strands. I lingered at the edge of the courtyard, not wanting to intrude, but she glanced up, smiled faintly, and asked about my day. We talked about trivial things at first, mail delivery quirks, the weather, a stray cat that liked to wander the complex, but gradually the conversation deepened. I told her about a book I had loved as a child, how the story had stayed with me through years of routine and quiet evenings. She listened, tilting her head just slightly, letting her hand rest near mine on the railing. Her eyes were soft, curious, attentive, and I realized how easy it was to lose myself in her presence. Then she shared a memory of her own. It wasn't dramatic, not something meant to impress. It was simple, quietly personal. She spoke of a small seaside town she had visited in her youth, the smell of salt in the air, the sound of waves against the shore. She closed her eyes briefly as she remembered it, and I noticed a faint tremor in her fingers as they brushed a stray lock of hair behind her ear. I felt a strange intimacy in witnessing this small vulnerability, the deliberate pause before she smiled again, the quiet depth in her gaze that suggested more than she was saying. There was a moment when our hands brushed against the railing simultaneously, close enough that the warmth of her skin seemed to echo through mine. I noticed the tension in her shoulders soften slightly, as if that simple touch had grounded her. Our conversation paused, not awkwardly, but in that charged, suspended way where words feel unnecessary, and every small detail, her laugh, the tilt of her head, the shimmer of sunlight across her cheek, becomes magnified. Over the next few days, these passing confidences became a pattern. We lingered longer on stairs, shared stories on quiet evenings, and found ourselves catching each other's eyes across the hallway in ways that felt deliberate yet delicate. Every smile, every accidental brush of hands carried an undercurrent of something deeper, an emotional intimacy growing quietly, organically, like vines curling around a trellis, slow but inevitable. Even mundane activities gained a new resonance. Handing her a stray piece of paper, I noticed the warmth in her fingers as they touched mine. Helping her adjust a fallen potted plant, I felt the strength and gentleness of her hands lingering against mine for just a fraction longer than necessary. These were not grand gestures, yet they left a lasting imprint, a subtle reminder that closeness could be expressed in the quietest of moments. By the end of this week, I was acutely aware of her presence even when she wasn't near. The sound of her laugh, the soft rhythm of her voice, the delicate warmth of her touch, it all wove itself into my thoughts. We were no longer merely neighbors exchanging polite greetings. We were two people building something fragile yet tangible, an emotional bridge constructed through stories, attention, and the unspoken recognition of shared longing. It was a quiet evening when she knocked on my door, holding a small ceramic tray with 2 mugs of coffee. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the faint scent of vanilla from her perfume, creating a warmth that felt almost tangible. "I thought you might like some company," she said softly, her voice carrying that same calm confidence that had intrigued me from the very first glance. My chest tightened, a mixture of anticipation and hesitation, as I stepped aside to let her in. Her apartment smelled faintly of books and the lingering sweetness of baked goods, and the soft hum of music from a corner speaker added a comfortable intimacy to the space. We sat on opposite ends of her couch at first, carefully measured distance between us, yet even across that space, I was acutely aware of her presence. The warmth radiating from her, the subtle brush of her hair against her cheek as she smiled, and the way her fingers curled gently around the mug, all of it made the ordinary act of drinking coffee feel charged with unspoken possibility. She leaned forward slightly to place her mug on the low table, and our hands brushed again, accidental, yet deliberate enough to send a small jolt through me. I caught a glimpse of her eyes, steady and inviting, and felt my own hesitation melt just slightly. Every tiny gesture, the way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the quiet exhale of breath, the soft shift of her weight closer to the couch's edge, spoke volumes. I realized then that these small movements, these shared silences, carried the intimacy that words alone could never achieve. We began talking, first about mundane things, favorite movies, a book she'd recently read, but the conversation slowly deepened, sliding effortlessly into personal reflections. I found myself laughing more freely than I had in weeks, and she laughed too, a soft, melodic sound that seemed to linger in the room long after the words had ended. At one point, her hand brushed mine again while reaching for the sugar bowl, and I felt the heat of her skin, the light pressure of her fingers, as if testing the boundaries of closeness. I couldn't stop the small smile that tugged at my lips. There were pauses too, quiet moments where words weren't necessary, and the silence itself became a vessel for connection. I noticed the subtle rise and fall of her chest as she sipped her coffee, the faint shimmer of light on her cheek, and the way her gaze would meet mine and hold, lingering, with a mixture of warmth and curiosity. The air seemed heavier with anticipation, yet soft and inviting, as if the universe had condensed into the small space between us. By the time she stood to refill our mugs, our proximity had become more natural, less measured. Our shoulders brushed as she passed, and I felt a subtle thrill at the touch, an awareness of closeness that went beyond mere neighborly politeness. I realized that the slow, deliberate way she moved, spoke, and interacted was drawing me in, creating a tension that was both thrilling and comforting. That evening, as she left, we lingered at the doorway, neither of us wanting to break the spell. Her hand brushed mine one final time, a fleeting, yet deliberate contact, and she smiled softly. "Next time you should come over first," she said lightly, and the invitation hung between us, unspoken but clear. I watched her walk away, my mind replaying every brush of her hand, every glance, every pause, realizing that this quiet, deliberate intimacy was only just beginning. It was one of those rare evenings when the world outside seemed to slow, leaving the two of us suspended in a quiet bubble of shared space. She had invited me over under the guise of showing me an old photograph album, but from the moment I stepped into her apartment, there was a warmth that went beyond the literal heat of the room. The soft hum of music from a corner speaker, the golden glow of the lamp, the subtle scent of vanilla and warm linen, it all created an atmosphere that felt intimate without being overwhelming. We sat close on the couch, not out of necessity but by choice. The album rested between us, its pages filled with snapshots of her life, yet I found myself distracted by the small, human details. The way her fingers lingered on a photograph, tracing the edges gently, the quiet curve of her lips when she remembered something fondly, the soft warmth radiating from her, as she leaned slightly closer to point something out. Every gesture felt deliberate yet effortless, drawing me in with a slow, intoxicating gravity. I reached over to hand her a photo, and our fingers brushed, lingering just a fraction longer than needed. The contact was electric in its subtlety. I became acutely aware of the warmth of her hand, the softness of her skin, and the quiet strength that seemed to radiate from her touch. She looked up at me then, her eyes catching the soft lamplight, and for a moment, words felt unnecessary. There was a mutual understanding in that gaze, an acknowledgement of something that had been growing quietly between us for weeks. We laughed together as she recounted a story from her youth, her head tilting slightly back, exposing the graceful line of her neck. I noticed the faint tremor in her fingers as she turned a page, the small intake of breath she didn't bother to hide, and I realized how acutely aware I had become of every nuance. The ordinary act of sitting together, sharing stories, flipping through an album, had transformed into something charged with intimacy. At one point, her hand brushed mine again, not accidental this time, but deliberate in its gentleness. I didn't pull away. Instead, I allowed my hand to rest near hers, feeling the warmth spread in quiet waves. The tension between us wasn't urgent or frantic. It was slow, deliberate, and simmering, a magnetic pull that neither of us had yet named aloud but both recognized. The subtle brush of shoulders, the way our knees nearly touched, the closeness of our breathing, all of it became a silent conversation, unspoken yet profoundly communicative. By the time the album was closed, I felt as if hours had passed in mere moments. We lingered on the couch, fingers almost touching, eyes meeting in those quiet pauses that spoke louder than words ever could. She leaned slightly toward me, just enough that the warmth of her shoulder brushed mine, and I realized that this slow, deliberate, unhurried closeness was what I had been craving without even knowing it. As I finally stood to leave, there was a softness in her gaze that matched the quiet ache in my chest. "Next time," she said, her voice low and steady, "let's start with coffee, and see where the evening takes us." I left her apartment feeling the echo of every gentle touch, every shared glance, and every moment of unspoken connection. That night, I knew something had shifted between us, delicate, profound, and entirely irreversible. After that evening, the quiet intensity between us didn't fade, it grew, simmering just beneath the surface of ordinary life. I found myself replaying every glance, every brush of her fingers, every laugh shared across that soft lamplight. But with that growing closeness came hesitation. The age difference, the whispers of propriety, the fear of misjudgment by neighbors or friends, all of it crowded my mind. I began to question every thought, every impulse, even though my heart insisted that the connection between us was undeniable. She, too, seemed aware of the tension. There were moments when I'd catch her looking at me from across the hallway, her gaze soft but searching, almost hesitant. Sometimes she would pause mid-step, hand hovering near a doorknob or a stray piece of paper, as if measuring whether to reach out or retreat. The subtlety of her hesitation spoke volumes. It was a mirror of my own internal struggle, the pull of desire, the thrill of intimacy, and the weight of caution all intertwined. One rainy evening, I found myself leaning against the window in my apartment, watching droplets race down the glass. The soft patter of rain seemed to echo the quiet turmoil inside me. My mind replayed our moments together, the lingering warmth of her hand, the way our shoulders had brushed so naturally, the gentle pull of her gaze when she told a story or laughed at a quiet joke. And yet the caution I felt wasn't just about appearances. It was the fear of rushing something fragile, the worry that too much too soon could shatter what had been slowly, carefully built. She reached out in her own way, though subtle. A hand brushing mine as she passed in the hallway, a soft laugh that lingered just a beat too long, a shoulder grazing mine in a crowded stairwell, all deliberate gestures that spoke of her feelings without breaking boundaries. Each touch sent a jolt of awareness through me, yet it also reminded me of the distance we maintained, the social and emotional lines we both navigated. The tension became a shared language, unspoken but profoundly understood, where restraint and desire coexisted. In those quiet pauses, I realized that hesitation itself could be intimate. The act of considering each gesture, of measuring closeness, of feeling the weight of unspoken desire, all of it made our eventual touches more potent, our glances more meaningful. It wasn't the absence of connection that defined us, but the careful, deliberate way we explored it. Every brush of her hand, every lingering look, every soft word carried the weight of intention and restraint. By the end of that week, the tension had transformed into something palpable, like a current flowing between us, invisible but undeniable. We were both aware of it, yet neither of us acted impulsively. And in that restraint, there was a promise, a quiet understanding that what we were building was worth waiting for, that the slow, deliberate pace would make the eventual closeness all the more profound. The hesitation wasn't a barrier. It was a testament to the depth of feeling, a prelude to the warmth and intimacy that would finally be allowed to unfold. It was a quiet evening when I found myself standing at her door again, the familiar nervous anticipation fluttering in my chest. The tension that had simmered between us for weeks, the hesitation, the longing, the delicate negotiation of closeness, was finally ready to be acknowledged. She opened the door with that same graceful confidence, but there was a softness in her eyes tonight, a quiet invitation that made the air between us feel warmer, more intimate. We settled into the living room, the low light casting a golden glow over the space, the faint hum of music adding a comforting rhythm. She handed me a cup of tea, her fingers brushing mine for just a moment longer than necessary, and I felt the warmth of her skin radiate into my own. The small gestures, the tilt of her head, the gentle curl of her fingers around the cup, the way her eyes met mine, were no longer tentative. They were deliberate expressions of connection, tender and unhurried, echoing everything we had built together in moments both fleeting and profound. As we talked, the conversation moved from shared stories to quieter admissions, small confessions of hope, of regret, of longing. I felt her hand inch closer to mine on the couch, and when our fingers finally intertwined, it was not abrupt or urgent but a natural, inevitable movement. The warmth of her hand, the softness of her touch, and the quiet steadiness of her presence made my chest ache in a way that was both thrilling and comforting. The subtle brush of her thumb against my knuckles, the gentle squeeze that communicated reassurance and trust, spoke louder than words ever could. She leaned slightly against me, just enough for our shoulders to touch, and I felt the warmth of her presence settle into my own. It was a gentle, grounding sensation, as if time itself had slowed to accommodate the quiet intimacy between us. I noticed the faint scent of her perfume mixing with the aroma of tea, the delicate rise and fall of her chest as she breathed, the soft rustle of her hair against her cheek. Every detail, every small movement, felt magnified, each one a testament to the closeness we had been building, slowly, carefully, deliberately. We sat like that for what felt like hours, talking, laughing softly, exchanging glances that lingered just a moment too long, brushing hands absent-mindedly across a shared space. There was no rush, no need to define the moment. It was enough to simply exist together, to feel the quiet current of connection that had grown between us. The tension that had once made our touches tremble with uncertainty had transformed into a calm, reassuring warmth that enveloped us both. Finally, as the evening drew to a close, she rested her head lightly against my shoulder, a simple, natural gesture that carried the weight of all our unspoken feelings. My hand found hers, fingers threading together, and I realized that every hesitant glance, every brushed hand, every small pause had led to this, an intimacy that was deep, tender, and profoundly human. When I left her apartment that night, the connection lingered, not as a fleeting thrill but as a quiet certainty. We had crossed the line from neighbors to something far more meaningful, and in the gentle rhythm of our closeness, I understood that this slow, deliberate journey had been worth every hesitant step. The warmth between us was no longer fragile, it was steady, enduring, and beautifully real.